Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing the next Middle Eastern war. Joining us on the show is Sharif Nashashebi, an award-winning journalist and Arab analyst on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
When ISIS first went into Iraq, what was the Kurds doing? What was their position?
Well, they basically had effectively taken advantage of the lightning advance in Iraq from ISIS, who had beaten back the Iraqi army. The Kurds then expanded their territory considerably by up to 40% of the Kurdish region pre-ISIS. And now they are locked in battle with ISIS on many fronts in Iraq. But certainly since ISIS expanded in Iraq, so have the Kurds. And the big repercussion of this conflict is that the Kurds in Iraq and Syria are being heavily armed, the ones particularly in Iraq, are being heavily armed to fight ISIS. But I think without proper consideration as to the consequences of what happens after, in terms of their national aspirations, there is an independence referendum coming up in Iraq, which will include the expanded territories, including Kirkuk, which is a very hotly contested city in Iraq. The Syrian Kurds have declared autonomy in the last year. There is fighting now renewed fighting between the PKK in Turkey and the Turkish government. So you have a heavily weaponized different Kurdish forces. You have more cooperation and coordination between these forces, and they're more assertive now. So you really have the potential that they are now going to press their national rights further, and this is going to create huge tensions, particularly in Iraq and Syria, but also potentially Turkey and probably to a lesser extent Iran.
But then with the situation in Kirkuk, because as you mentioned, Iraq and Kurdistan have been, arguing and debating about Kirkuk either being for the Kurds or for the Iraqi nation. As that's actually, they've kind of like terrorized the area and they've taken advantage of ISIS being there. How come they're going to be able to take that city?
Well, the Kurds have already taken Kirkuk. So what they've said now in terms of the referendum is they've put it on hold. They haven't cancelled it. They've postponed it until they're done with ISIS. They said that's the priority now, the fight against ISIS, and then we're going to have the referendum. But at no point since ISIS expanded have they said we're going to cancel that referendum. It's still on. So once ISIS is defeated, once the Kurds defeat them, or they're defeated generally, then they're going to go ahead with this referendum. They currently are in control. They've been in control of Kirkuk since after ISIS took Mosul. So they're in control of those territories, and the risk is now is if there is any opposition to these extra territories being included in the referendum, the Kurds will now have a lot of weapons to defend the territorial gains and to defend any statehood should they vote for it. And of course, if there's a referendum, overwhelmingly they will vote for statehood. So I think they'll be better able to defend and consolidate the gains that they've made.
So, but when just thinking about it, it's not really just for Kurdistan to take these new cities that they've kind of like took over from ISIS, as originally they're actually for the Iraqi nation. They're for the Christian Iraqis and for the Yazidis mainly, and the Sunnis even.
Well, this is what's made the situation very complicated, is if the referendum was limited to the original territory of Iraqi Kurdistan, as we know it, then that would have been far less controversial, because I think they have been building autonomy. I mean, they've had autonomy since the early 90s, so it's been such a long time that I think that the people in the region and the governments had accepted the idea that slowly and surely they're going to get to that stage. I mean, even for instance, there's a flourishing relationship between Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan, which has become much better over the years. But I think the main controversy now is that they're expanding these territories, they're including them in the region that's going to be in the referendum. And I think that there's going to be far more opposition to that because it's been taken by force, and it's going to be under a referendum that other Iraqis have no say in, whether these territories are included. And cities like Kirkuk are very mixed. It's not just Kurds there, it's Turkmen, it's Assyrians, it's lots of different sects. And on top of that, a lot of the territories they've captured, particularly around Kirkuk, is oil rich. So this has a huge economic factor as well. The same can be said of the Syrian region, the Kurdish region in Syria, which is very resource rich. So the expansion and inclusion of these territories in the referendum is going to make the situation for them much harder. It's much more likely to increase the ferocity of opposition to the referendum in general.
Do you think that the majority of people are going to be voting for independence?
Oh, the Kurds, of course. I think it's a foregone conclusion that they'll vote for independence, no doubt about it.
But how is that going to actually help and support them? And what's going to then happen to Iraq and Syria?
Well, look, I think largely, besides the nationalism of the idea, that the Kurds, they're described as the world's biggest stateless people. They want their independence. Besides the national feeling of wanting independence, they have, during their autonomy in Iraq, for instance, they have been much more stable in terms of security, in terms of the economy. So they have developed, de facto as a separate entity from Iraq, and in a way that has shielded them from a lot of the chaos that Iraq has experienced. Also, to an extent, before the expansion of ISIS in Syria, the northeast, the Kurdish region in Syria, was relatively more stable and peaceful than the rest of Syria. So partly it's the kind of the nationalist sentiment, but also that they don't want to be part of the rest of the region, which is chaotic. But the difficulty is in terms of independence is whichever Kurdish, if there's a Kurdish state in Iraq or one in Syria, any Kurdish territorial independent state or autonomous state is completely landlocked. So it's completely dependent on its neighboring countries. So really, to an extent, the viability of independence rests on the blessing of surrounding countries which won't give that blessing. Furthermore, the US is opposed to independence. They want a united Iraq territorially. And the Kurds owe their autonomy to the US. So all the people it needs to rely on to ensure a viable Kurdish state are opposed to the idea, and its neighboring countries could be vehemently opposed. If they decide to blockade a landlocked country, they're going to be in real trouble. So this is a real problem for the Kurds. Is in terms of nationalist sentiment, the knee-jerk reaction is for independence, but then I think they have to think also, how is it going to work in practice according to the reactions of the surrounding states?
Before we discuss how the US feel about the whole situation of Kurdistan becoming independent, as the Kurds have taken more than one city, which is originally for the Iraqi people, isn't that, and they actually then vote to become independent, isn't that going to cause war between, other than the other neighboring countries, but just between the Iraqi people and the Iraqi Kurds? Well,
that's the danger, is that it could be a regional war. I mean, it could involve forces in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And the opposition to Kurdish independence or further autonomy it transcends any sectarian divisions, any political divisions. I mean, if you look at the various forces fighting ISIS, some of them are conflicting with each other. They're all opposed to Kurdish independence. I mean, in Syria, the regime is, so are the opposition groups. In Iraq, the Shias are, the Sunnis are. It transcends any of these divisions. So I think, similarly to the fight against ISIS now, where you have various forces fighting against ISIS who don't necessarily get on with each other or even fighting each other, they are all fighting a common enemy at the moment in terms of ISIS. The same could happen in terms of the Kurds, where divisions could be papered over in kind of unanimous opposition to Kurdish independence, and they could all focus on tackling the Kurds. And I think this is what the Kurds need to be very wary of, is that they've taken advantage at the moment of divisions in the region to expand their territory and enhance their status. But taking that too far could unite these opposing forces at the moment to focus on the threat to the territorial integrity of these various countries.
So shouldn't the Kurds actually wait and not do the voting so everyone can become happy, or at least accept Kurdistan becoming independent?
Well, at the moment they've said they're going to wait till the fight against ISIS is over.
But nothing's official yet.
Nothing is, and it's going to be. It will be a very difficult decision to make as to when to have the referendum. I mean, when would regional conditions be ripe for something like that? They may never be. I mean, it's I think the dilemma at the moment is not whether there will no longer be opposition to these Kurdish national aspirations, but whether that opposition will be enough to cause a military conflict. I mean, there might, for instance, given the state of the region, there might be opposition from governments, but whether that's actually going to cause them to go to war over it, that's the dilemma that the Kurds face. But I don't think I don't think we're anywhere near the stage in the region where there's going to be this regional acceptance of yes, we should have a Kurdish state. I think it's whether we want to militarily oppose a Kurdish state or not.
So the main concern or the main thing that people are actually worried about is if there's going to actually be a war between the two countries.
Well, it's not just the war. It's that if there is if the Kurdish territories in Iraq or Syria, whether they're independent or whether they have further autonomy, it's the fact that a lot of these territories are resource rich, whether in terms of energy or agriculture. So it has a very big bearing, not just in terms of the military context, but in terms of the economies of these countries. It will greatly affect the economies. So the rest of the peoples of those countries, let's say at least for selfish reasons, are not going to want those territories to secede. So there's a military aspect and there's an economic aspect and a political aspect. And at the moment, apart from Israel, the region is fairly unanimous in terms of opposition to any further enhancement of Kurdish status in terms of autonomy or independence.
Touching upon Israel, there are apparently rumours that Israel is actually supporting Kurdistan to become independent because they're going to be allies.
It's not rumours. I mean, Netanyahu this summer made it very clear that we should support Kurdish independence. He said that outright. And there have long been clandestine ties between Israel and the Kurds. And this is a lot of what's fueling opposition in the region, is that any independent Kurdish state will be a strong ally of Israel and further weaken the rest of the region. So I think when Netanyahu came out with a statement, I think from the Kurdish point of view, they probably would have wished that he kept his mouth shut, because this really cemented the regional concerns that there's going to be some alliance between Israel and a Kurdish state, and this will create further chaos in the region. So at least publicly, Israel is an ally the Kurds may not want to have.
But then if they were to become independent, the Kurds, and then be allies of Israel, that's going to cause a really big conflict, not only in Iraq itself, but then in Iran, in Syria, and in Lebanon, because Israel is seen as a threat and as an enemy to these countries.
Yes, and that's why the potential for this conflict, this future conflict, to be as wide-ranging as the conflict we have today is very real. I mean, it will affect most of the countries in the Levant and further into the Arabian Peninsula. This would have very wide-ranging consequences. So I think the worry right now is in the rush to arm the Kurds in the fight against ISIS, the West is not properly considering the effects of what happens afterwards. When the Kurds press their national rights and their aspirations, what happens next? You have a militarized forces that could press these gains, that could potentially destabilize the countries surrounding it. If there's an alliance with Israel, it would draw further countries in the region. This has huge ramifications, and I think in this rush to fight ISIS, there isn't proper consideration of what happens afterwards.
Why are they arming the Kurds so much if you're saying that they're not actually considering the side effects afterwards, but why just mainly the Kurds?
Well, if you look at the different forces fighting ISIS, the Kurds, from the point of view of the West, were probably the safest bet, because the Iraqi army melted away when ISIS advanced in Iraq. It melted away very quickly. The other forces fighting ISIS, I mean, the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, Iran, the Shia militias, the West won't work with them. So they were not going to supply them. And the Syrian opposition there is little trust and little faith in the Syrian opposition. These are all the forces fighting ISIS. So of all these forces, the Kurds seem to be the safest bet for the West. But that doesn't mean, I mean, for now that might be the case, but they haven't stopped to think, okay, well, what happens after that? And that's the danger.
But then when the whole situation in Iraq escalated and ISIS went into Iraq and was expanding, we had the Ayatollah of Iraq, which is say Sistani, saying that, telling the people to go and fight. So wouldn't they have been able to arm those people instead of the Kurds, for example?
Well, I mean, firstly, there was a fear from when Sistani made that statement that was going to just create Shia militias, because he is a spiritual leader of the Shia. So there has been no appetite for the West to arm any of these militias, because they would be seen as a sectarian force that would be under the influence of Iran. So for various reasons, according to relations between Iran and the US and with Europe and whatnot, that was never going to happen. They were never going to arm those. Also, creating a volunteer army or volunteer militias to fight, under whose authority do they fight? They're not part of the Iraqi army. There's no oversight. So it would be highly contentious to arm them when there would be no real accountability as to how are the weapons used, who do they go to. Similarly with the reluctance to arm the Syrian opposition. What happens to these weapons? Who do they go to? Do they switch allegiances? Is there infighting? For the same reasons, it was never going to be likely that the West would supply these various forces.
But then, as a spiritual leader was to say this, and he made it very clear that when men are going to go and fight, that they should be careful not to hurt any civilian. If they were to capture an ISIS member, that they would treat him respectfully, of course, imprison him and so on. But
he said this months after his initial statement for people to take up arms and fight. This was only recently that he clarified this in light of the abuses of Shia militias against populations where they would capture territory from ISIS. There were wholesale atrocities, committed as revenge acts, and that's when Sistani came out saying, "You can't do this. You have to look after the people in the territories you're taking over." I think he realized that the reliance on these militias by the government was having a momentum of its own that was going to create further resentment and swell the ranks of ISIS. So that statement came much later, and I think that what was a realization by him, that when you have these various forces that are not under any particular authority, that are a law unto themselves, you have a very real potential for the same kind of atrocities that ISIS is committing.
But isn't that the same thing as the Kurds? Are the Kurds who are fighting ISIS at the moment, are they from the Kurdish army, or are they just tribes?
I mean, from what I see, the Kurds as a military force are much more organized and coordinated. So I don't think you don't have Kurdish militias as such. You have, because the Kurdish forces, the Peshmerga and these different organizations, they've existed for quite some time. So it's not like they had to suddenly come up out of nowhere now that ISIS expanded. Whereas a lot of the militias now fighting in Iraq, they have been called up very recently. So I think the Kurds, they don't need militias because they have a very structured, organized military apparatus, and it wouldn't benefit them to have to use militias as well, because that then waters down the organization and structure of the military force. I think that's what's made them effective, is the fact that they're organized and they're a unified force, rather than all these different various forces fighting with each other or against each other, or
But then, when we're to watch Iraqi news, especially the Iraqi government news, you would see a lot of armed men, from the Iraqi army, going to fight ISIS and hopefully bring peace to Iraq. So is that just something we're just seeing just to keep us all quiet and keep us all calm?
Well, government stations, of course, you have to take with a pinch of salt. But also, if the West had not come to the military aid of the government, if Iran hadn't come to the aid of the government, if they hadn't relied on the militias, the Iraqi army probably wouldn't exist, and certainly this government wouldn't exist. I mean, they literally, these various opposing forces came together to save the government and the army. I mean, the army was near collapse. They gave up Mosul, which is a major city in Iraq, almost without a fight. They just melted away. And ISIS had that kind of momentum where if there was not this kind of outside help, it wouldn't be around. And they're able now to start launching counter-offensives, but only because of the considerable military aid that they've received from outside countries that are opposed to each other. They've all come together.
So the situation in Iraq has actually brought more countries together to unite in a way.
Well, they're not united. I mean, they have a common party that they're propping up, the Iraqi government, but very different reasons for doing so. And there's no well, both sides say, in terms of, say, Iran and the US, that they're not coordinating with each other, but they're both helping the same party. So it hasn't unified them, but it's certainly consolidated their efforts into propping up the same party. But then you have the potential for this tug of war over influence over the government or the army. You know, who will have more influence, the Americans or the Iranians? And this really dates back to the US invasion. I mean, this is a long story. But I think it's allowed, for example, you know, just as the US had been withdrawing from Iraq, it's allowed them now to come back in, you know, under a kind of a pretext of legitimacy and urgency. And I think under stealth by saying, well, we're sending advisors, and the number of advisors keeps growing, and the role the advisors play keeps growing. And there's really no doubt that when they say there's going to be no ground operations, there's no doubt that these advisors are operating on the ground. It's given them, the Americans, the opportunity to come in again and actually this time not be opposed. The Iraq is kind of begging them to come in and help them. So it's provided them an opportunity which they hadn't had before.
Do you think as the US has already, you know, gone back into Iraq, wouldn't it have been better if the actual troops and soldiers went into Iraq and attacked or fought against ISIS instead of arming the Kurds and arming other people? What
if American troops came in?
Yeah.
I don't think there would be any appetite, either in America or in Iraq or in the region, in the Middle East, for an official foreign invasion, another one. I mean, look, the US invasion wasn't that long ago of Iraq. There would be no acceptance for that. I mean, there would be there would be huge domestic opposition in America and throughout the region and in Iraq. So that would be untenable. So what they've done to overcome this is to do it by stealth. Send in, you know, a few hundred advisors, then send in some more advisors, then expand their role. So it's a creeping effect. And under this kind of mission creep, and also the threat that ISIS poses, that people are either accepting this or turning a blind eye or not realizing that the American presence on the ground is growing slowly and surely. The same is happening with Iranian influence and with the Shia militias. They are all, you know, expanding their influence in Iraq under the pretext of, you know, we need to fight ISIS. But that means on the ground, the country is really awash with different troops, different interests, and not, although they're fighting a common enemy, they're not fighting alongside each other. They are actually in opposition with each other.
With that situation, when ISIS is going to be defeated, hopefully very soon, what's going to then happen to Iraq, as they've been, you know, helped by the US and by Iran? Both countries are going to want to influence Iraq as a country. So what's going to happen then?
Well, so you have firstly I don't agree with part of your statement. I don't think, unfortunately, that ISIS is going to be defeated soon. I think this is going to be a long, complicated, drawn-out conflict.
We're just hoping.
Well, let's hope, yeah. But I think this is what's happening right now is with all these different you know, interests and forces and governments coming in to fight, they're at the same time jockeying for a better position for the post-ISIS situation in Iraq and in Syria. Who's going to hold sway? So they're coming in to help, but also they want to help themselves. They want the spoils of what happens afterwards. So there's little doubt. I don't think that, you know, the defeat of ISIS is not going to be the end of the problem, whether in Iraq or in Syria. You had fighting, you know, you had division, you had, you know, insecurity before ISIS in both countries. So I think as long as the fight against ISIS is seen purely in military terms and as if ISIS is the problem and its defeat is the solution, I don't think we're going to see an end to conflict. There are root causes that have led to the situation we're in now, and I don't think they're being addressed. I think we are tackling the symptom and not the cause.
But then, when do you think that's why ISIS isn't actually defeated yet? Because, you know, the US having all its power, and the same with Iran, like it's known for to be able to defeat, you know, any enemy. Do you think that's why ISIS still exists? Because they want to make sure that they have their position first before ISIS is completely removed?
There are a lot of factors why ISIS have proven much more stubborn than people thought. I mean, for one thing, they have played on suspicions and fears regarding the different parties fighting ISIS. So, for example, this Western-led coalition, the US-led coalition, they have played on this as that they're trying to recruit fighters now to fight Western imperialism. So all these fears of Western intervention in the Middle East, which is very real and very legitimate, ISIS has played on that to swell its ranks. Then on the other side as well, fighting the Iranians and the Shia militias and the Syrian regime. Then they're saying, people come help us to counter Shia aggression. So they are exploiting these fears to swell its ranks. Also, the alliance's decision to start attacking Al Qaeda as well, I think, has only helped ISIS, because until the campaign against ISIS, certainly in Syria, the Al-Nusra Front and ISIS were fighting against each other. Now they've closed ranks, because they're both under attack. And you have this situation where, yes, there are lots of different forces fighting ISIS, but they're not working together. A lot of them are opposed to each other. So that has also allowed them to play different forces off against each other and to exploit the situation. So for all these different reasons, it has been able to in some areas hold ground, in some areas gain ground, and to keep the flow of recruitment going. I mean, even American officials have said that the campaign so far hasn't blunted the recruitment for ISIS ranks. So I think the campaign, in many ways, is actually making the situation worse rather than making it better.
So you mentioned Al-Qaeda is also going to be attacked. How come when recently they've said that Al-Qaeda isn't actually as bad as ISIS and other groups are?
Well, the American statements have been kind of, quite contradictory in this regard. I mean, they have said that, but then they've also suddenly, now you hear about this Khorasan group, which no one ever heard of before, and suddenly now they are the biggest threat, even bigger than ISIS. And they're bombing this group. No one really knows what they are, who they are, do they really exist, are they the threat that they are? And from day one, from the first day of the bombing campaign, they targeted al-Nusra positions. So they have targeted both ISIS and Nusra, who are fighting each other, and now they aren't fighting each other. And you have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Maghreb, who have said that they support ISIS against the coalition. I mean, from a tactical point of view, this was a real blunder with regard to the West, is that these two major opposing jihadist forces are now fighting alongside each other because they see a common threat. That was a major blunder on the part of the coalition.
But then shouldn't the opposing groups kind of learn from ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, because as they've become one group now and are working together in a way, shouldn't the opposition, the ones fighting against ISIS, also do the same thing in a way?
Well, they are trying, but in effect we have two coalitions fighting ISIS. You have the Western-led coalition, which includes some of the Arab states, and then you have this coalition of Hezbollah, Iran, the Syrian regime, the Shia militias in Iraq. The Iraqi government is involved in both coalitions, but you have two different opposing coalitions fighting ISIS. Both of them arouse very real fear and suspicions in the region, and ISIS plays on both these different suspicions and fears to swell its own ranks. So I think because of this, the very fact that these different forces, yes, they're fighting ISIS, but then they are also opposed to each other, has allowed ISIS to gain from these kind of very fundamental divisions in the campaign against it.
When we go back to looking at Kurdistan and it becoming an independent state, what's the position of the US?
Well, officially the US has always said it favors the territorial integrity of Iraq. But the irony is that, again, the heavy arming of the Kurds is enabling them to break off. So it says it supports Iraq as one unitary state, but it's enabling it to break up. The same with Syria. So it's, it says one thing, but it's doing something that's creating another situation. And this again, it seems a very obvious byproduct of all this arming of the Kurds. So it's kind of baffling that the US hasn't really thought about this. And if the Kurds break away, this will cause a very serious headache for the US, not just in terms of its relations with the Iraqi government, which is a major ally in the region, but also Turkey, which is another major ally in the region, which is vehemently opposed to Kurdish independence. So this will prove a major headache for the US.
Would the US be able to influence the Kurds in not having an independent state?
So far, they have stated verbally that they want the Kurds to hold off on this, but that hasn't changed the Kurdish mind so far. And I think the situation that Barzani, the president of Iraqi Kurdistan, the situation he has now is that now that he's announced this referendum, it's going to be very hard for him to cancel this. This would cause a major backlash among his own people. Because I think the idea of independence is a very popular one. Holding the referendum is a popular move. So once you open that box, it's very hard to close it again. So he's in a difficult situation where he doesn't want to alienate his allies abroad, but if he pulls back from that, he could face a big backlash at home.
Do you think that they'll be able to kind of influence the people in a way, like the Kurds? Or kind of tell them, let's just wait for a bit until things just settle slightly?
Well, I think probably the route they're going to go down, as they've started saying recently, is not now, But then the next question is when. And if the leadership keeps indefinitely postponing the referendum, eventually the Kurds, domestically are going to get very unrestful and say, well, how long do we have to wait for this? This is our right. This is what we've been told to expect. When's it going to happen?
But then when we look at Kurdistan, especially Iraq, they've got their own flag, they've got their own government. If an Iraqi wants to go into Kurdistan, they need a visa. So they kind of already have, their independent state. However, it's not recognized by the whole world. Why do they need it to be recognized? What is it going to change?
Well, you rightly said, this forms part of the apprehension about making independence official, because at the moment, by and large, Kurdistan acts independently from Iraq. So, there are Kurds who say, we have it good right now. Do we need to risk that to go further when, really we do what we want anyway? But I think, it would certainly, let's say if an independent state received international recognition, it would certainly help, because at the moment, in terms of oil sales, in terms of trade, a lot of countries around the world are reluctant to deal directly with the Kurds because it will upset Iraq and Turkey and other countries in the region. So there is, to an extent, a hands-off approach that, we don't want to annoy our friends in the region, so let's not deal direct with them. I think that is what the Kurds are hoping in terms of an independent state that is recognized, that would circumvent that. But again, as I said, the problem is Kurdistan will be landlocked. So even if they want to trade with outside countries, if the surrounding countries blockade it or decide not to help it economically, it's going to be very difficult to be economically viable. So there are even worries among the Kurds that we've achieved a lot so far. This may jeopardize it, and a referendum that's going to pass is going to create independence will jeopardize all the gains we've made so far.
Not just that, many political analysts have stated that the Kurds actually take a lot of money from the Iraqi government in order to build and develop Kurdistan. So if they were to be blocked from that, and yes, they do have, oil-rich cities and everything else, but then they won't have as much access to the money as they would if they were independent.
Well, there are a lot of conflicting reports about this. I mean, you have the Kurds will say that they give disproportionately more to the central government than they get back. The central government will say the opposite. So there's a lot of claim and counterclaim. But certainly, I think a lot of the impetus behind consolidating Kurdish gains is that so far they have done relatively much better than the rest of Iraq, over the last 2 decades. So there is a sense that from the Kurds that why would we want to remain part of this failed state really down south when we've been doing really well? So let's push that. but then the other argument is, well, we may push too far and then jeopardize that. So it's a very delicate balancing act the Kurds have to perform at the moment.
But isn't it better for them, though, that they have developed more than Iraq, in the sense that more people would actually go and visit Kurdistan instead of going to other places in Iraq, for example?
Well, yeah, but when you're talking about nationalist sentiment, generally, as a principle, a lot of this is based on emotion. People, if there is an ethnic group or a nation that feels that they should have their own country, a lot of that is based on emotion rather than rational debate. For instance, if you watch the coverage of the Scottish referendum, there was a lot of claim and counterclaim, but a lot of people were unwilling to have their minds changed because they were either implacably opposed to independence or implacably opposed to the remaining part of the Union. And it was a very emotional thing that sometimes people didn't really know the facts surrounding the argument. They just inherently knew that they either wanted to be part of the Union or wanted independence. So it's an emotional thing. So people feel that's their right, that they've been waiting for a long time, and that why shouldn't we? And I think that's the thing here, is we can sit and discuss the strategic aspects, the economic, political, security aspects. But when people feel that they deserve a state of their own, that's very difficult to counteract. It's an emotional thing that they want to press, and a lot of debate will not necessarily change their minds.
But then if we're to look at Scotland and Britain, everyone assumed that Scotland is going to become independent, and many politicians were actually really scared because it's going to break a lot of things and ruin a lot of things. So how come, do you think it will be kind of like the same in Kurdistan, where the majority won't actually want to become independent?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the in terms of Scottish independence, there was never an overwhelming majority in favor of independence. I mean, the pro-independence vote had been creeping up over the decades, but even until now, I mean, this referendum was described as the zenith of pro-independence feeling. But even then, it was always a very close race. I mean, initially people really dismissed it. They said, of course we're not going to get anywhere near independence. And then when they started realizing that there was a big movement, then there was this counter movement. But there was never a clear majority in favor of independence. Whereas in Kurdistan, there has always been this overall sentiment that we want to be an independent state. There used to be. I mean, the Kurds did enjoy, for a time, their own state, not just in Iraq, in Iran as well, and so it's not necessarily just a theoretical idea. They used to enjoy it. They're a very big stateless people with traditions and cultures and language that are different from necessarily from the countries that they're part of. So if I was Kurdish, I would understand that if countries like South Sudan can be independent, or if Catalonia wants independence, or the Scots, well, why don't we? Why are we different? Why don't we deserve the same thing?
No, I understand. If someone wants their own rights, that we can all understand. But then looking at it overall, politically and economically, not as much, because Iraq can survive economically without the Kurds. But then just looking at it politically, to divide Iraq even more than it's already divided, that's just going to cause more chaos, really.
Yes, but it's that we can't. The problem with that argument is it's not like things were harmonious before all these problems. I mean, the Kurds in these different countries have a history of being repressed, of having their rights removed. I mean, they have been discriminated against wholesale, but through various policies in these different countries. So this really fueled the nationalist sentiment to say, well, we're not being treated like equal citizens in these countries. The situation differs by country, but they've all had a history of oppression, and that has fueled nationalist sentiment. If they were really kind of properly integrated in these countries, there wouldn't be that kind of sentiment. And that's why, for example, with the Scottish referendum, there was never this overwhelming desire for independence, because Scots, by and large, are treated just as the English, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish. There hasn't been this discrimination wholesale against Scottish people. If there were, I think it would have been very different. There would have been a much greater sentiment for breaking away.
But then when we to look at oppression, all sects and all different, ethnic groups were already being oppressed, regardless of, what area we're talking about. If it was Turkey, Iran, Syria, and especially Iraq. Like in Iraq, in Saddam's time, you had the Shia, you had the Sunnis, and you had the Kurds. It was a whole type of thing. It wasn't just a certain group.
Yes, but if you look, I mean, the Kurds are a much larger minority group in these countries than other minority groups. So it has the necessary numbers and territorial. There are specific provinces and areas in each country which are distinctly Kurdish. So I think the numbers and the territorial contiguity of a lot of these territories has enabled them to press their rights more than, let's say Druze or Assyrians or other minorities. So that it would be much easier for them to press those rights than, because they constitute. I mean, in Iraq they're about up to a quarter of the population, up to 20% in Turkey, up to 15% in Syria. These are big numbers, and because they're concentrated in certain areas, that makes it easier for them.
But then, if we're gonna be just looking at it like that, what about all the other groups? Like in Saddam's time, it was mainly the Shia being oppressed, and now there are reports that the Sunnis are being oppressed. So should they just kind of like divide Iraq as Kurdistan, Sunni state and Shia state, and get this whole...
Well, the Shias in Iraq, I mean, I don't think it would be... there's never been a movement for a breakaway Shia state. Because I mean, I think the situation of the Shias after the US invasion of Iraq, I mean, they ascended into political power in the country. So for them, it's in their interest to maintain influence and power over the whole country rather than say, well, we're going to break away, because then that lessens their sphere of influence. So it wouldn't make sense for them to break away because they form a majority in different ways in Iraq. ISIS is encouraging this idea that, Sunnis will never have the equality and their rights in Iraq as it is now, so they should break away. So there is certainly separatist sentiment among the Kurds. To an extent, there is that kind of feeling among the Sunnis, but for the Shias, because they form the major power brokers in Iraq, they wouldn't want that. They want a unitary country where they can have influence over the whole country.
When we look back at Kurdistan, because there are Kurds in Turkey, there are Kurds in Iran and in Syria, and it's only in Iraq that the Kurds are going to be having a referendum. What about the other Kurds?
Well, I think next in line in terms of the level to which they've extended their status, the Syrian Kurds have made the most progress after the Iraqi Kurds. I mean, they enjoyed de facto autonomy since the early days of the uprising against Bashar Assad. And then they declared autonomy late last year and the beginning of this year. And they have now agreed at least tentatively on a government, on a parliament. It's setting the foundations of an autonomous region that could end up eventually the way that the Iraqi Kurds are going. I mean, it's looking now, the situation in Syrian Kurdistan is looking now similar to when the Kurds gained autonomy in Iraq in the early 1990s. So people will be wary that it started similarly, it could end the same way, that eventually they're going to build on this, and then there will be a referendum on independence, and by then it will be an accepted, that, well, there's nothing much we can do about it, in the region, so we have to just accept it. So I think that's the fear. Turkey, less so, but you have a peace process that has been going on in Turkey that is in jeopardy at the moment. There has been renewed fighting between the government and the PKK. Who have threatened to call off the whole peace process completely. So there is still a lot of dangers being faced in Turkey. There is widespread unrest among Kurds in Turkey. The government has cracked down very violently against them, and that's inflamed the situation. You have a lot of anger about Turkey's reluctance to get involved in Syria, particularly around the issue of Kobani. So it's Turkey, again, there are very real fears there. Iran has probably the least to worry. There hasn't been a great deal of unrest at all, really, so far. But again, Iran will be worried. All these countries, they're not just worried about the Kurds in their own countries. They're worried about the domino effect. Should a neighboring country, establish a Kurdish state, what happens, to the other countries? So I think this is something they're all very worried about.
One last question before we end the show. If the Kurds in Iraq and in Syria and in Turkey, and maybe even in Iran, were to become independent, what kind of state are they going to be called? Because they're all Kurdish, but they're kind of like different. They're in different regions.
Well, I think I don't think that's something even the Kurds have really contemplated at the moment, because you have the Kurds in each country. Their status is very different from their status in other countries. So because I think they're at very different levels and stages of their aspirations and their rights, I don't think they've really thought about what happens when there's going to be either 4 separate Kurdish states or one big united Kurdish state, because we're nowhere near that at the moment. And then there's also the issue of would Kurdish sentiment result in an overall Kurdish state, or are there going to be different Kurdish states? But these are academic arguments in the future. But we're nowhere near that at the moment. The only likelihood now is as an independent Iraqi Kurdish state. But nowhere else is it remotely a possibility that they would be considering what to call it and what it would look like. And
thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.